1,141 gallons. That was the fuel load on each B-25 bomber lined up on the deck of the USS Hornet on the morning of April 18, 1942. Every man on that flight deck had already done the math. It wasn't enough to get them home. 16 bombers, 80 men. Every single one of them a volunteer who had signed up for a mission they weren't told the details of, only that it was extremely dangerous and that there was no guarantee any of them would survive it. The original plan called for launching 400 miles off the coast of Japan, under cover of darkness, with just enough fuel to reach friendly airfields in China after the attack. It was already a desperate margin. Then, at dawn on the day of the launch, a Japanese picket boat spotted the American task force, 650 miles from Japan. 250 miles farther out than the plan had ever accounted for. Admiral William Halsey had seconds to decide. Launch now, at extreme range, with no realistic chance of reaching land, or abort the mission entirely and sail home with 16 bombers still chained to the deck. He gave the order to launch. At 8:20 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's bomber rolled down the rain-slicked deck of the Hornet and lifted into the wind with feet to spare before the bow. One by one, 15 more followed. Every man aboard those aircraft now knew, with absolute mathematical certainty, that they did not have enough fuel to make it to safety. They flew anyway. To understand why 80 men would volunteer for a mission they knew might cost them their lives, it's necessary to understand the moment America was in the winter of 1941 and 1942. Pearl Harbor had been attacked on December 7, 1941. In the weeks that followed, Japan's military advance across the Pacific seemed unstoppable. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, all fell in rapid succession. American morale, both military and civilian, was at its lowest point of the entire war. President Franklin Roosevelt, in a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on December 21, 1941, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, made clear that he wanted Japan bombed as soon as possible, specifically to demonstrate to the American public and to the Japanese military that the home islands were not untouchable. The technical problem was straightforward and brutal. Japan was too far from any American base for conventional bombers to reach it, and no aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet had bombers with the range to strike Japan and return. The idea that solved this problem came from an unlikely source. Navy Captain Francis Lowe, after watching aircraft practice carrier landings on a runway painted to resemble a flight deck at Naval Station Norfolk, reported to Admiral Ernest King that twin-engine Army bombers might be capable of launching from a carrier deck, something no one had attempted in combat before. The Army's B-25 Mitchell medium bomber was selected. It had never been designed to take off from a ship. Jimmy Doolittle, already a legendary test pilot, the first man to fly entirely on instruments, and one of the first Americans to earn a doctorate in aeronautical science from MIT, was assigned to determine whether it could be done, and ended up volunteering to lead the mission himself. The B-25s that launched from the Hornet had each been modified specifically for a mission with no realistic way back. The lower gun turret was stripped out to save weight. The tail gun position, useless on a medium bomber never designed for rear defense, was replaced with 2 broomsticks, painted black, mounted to look like machine gun barrels from a distance. It was a bluff designed to deter Japanese fighters from attacking from behind. Every modification on every aircraft had the same underlying logic. There would be no second mission, no return engagement, and no need to bring anything back that wasn't essential to getting the bombs over Tokyo. 24 crews trained at Eglin Field in Florida for 3 weeks in March 1942, under a level of secrecy that even Doolittle himself struggled to maintain. The men were never told their actual target. They were told only that the mission was extremely hazardous, and they trained obsessively for the one skill that would determine whether they lived or died before they ever reached Japan: getting a fully loaded medium bomber off the ground, in a distance that conventional Army training manuals said was simply not possible. The training itself was relentless and specific. Crews practiced short-field takeoffs to the point where pilots could coax a fully loaded B-25 into the air in distances that would have seemed impossible to them weeks earlier. They flew low-altitude navigation drills almost exclusively at treetop height, since the entire mission to Japan would be flown at roughly 200 feet above the waves to avoid Japanese radar and aircraft detection. Night flying, overwater navigation without reliable landmarks, and low-altitude bombing rounded out a curriculum that had clearly been built around one specific, undisclosed mission profile, even though the men executing it still didn't know where they were going. A Navy flight instructor, Lieutenant Henry Miller, was assigned from nearby Naval Air Station Pensacola, specifically to oversee carrier takeoff training, despite the Army crews having no aircraft carrier available to practice on at Eglin. He drilled them on technique, using the runway alone, and would later accompany the crews all the way to the launch itself, an unusual level of personal investment that earned him recognition as an honorary member of the Raiders. According to the official Air Force account of the mission, each aircraft would carry 1,141 gallons of fuel, nearly double the B-25's normal capacity, with the final 50 gallons stored in 5-gallon cans that crew members would have to manually pour into the tanks mid-flight. The expectation, even under ideal conditions, was that no aircraft would need to fly farther than 2,000 miles non-stop. The bombers had been modified to handle 2,400 miles if absolutely necessary. The plan, as Doolittle had drafted it by hand in February 1942, called for the carriers to bring the bombers to within 400 to 500 miles of the Japanese coast. The B-25s would take off at night, strike Tokyo at dawn, then continue across the East China Sea to land at airfields near Quchao in eastern China that Chinese forces had been asked, though never formally confirmed, to prepare and illuminate for a night landing. That arrangement was never finalized. China's military, fighting for its survival against the ongoing Japanese invasion, never coordinated the landing details the mission depended on. The Doolittle Raiders would in the end be entirely on their own after the bombs fell on Tokyo. On the morning of April 18th, the early detection by the Japanese picket boat collapsed even that fragile margin. Halsey's order to launch immediately meant the bombers would now need an additional 250 miles of range they had never planned for, fuel that simply did not exist in their tanks. According to the account preserved by the Air University's historical review of the mission, the bombers flew the entire 650-mile approach to Japan at an altitude of barely 200 feet above the waves, low enough to avoid radar detection, but low enough that a single mechanical failure or navigational error meant the ocean. The crews took turns at the controls while the gunners watched the fuel gauges obsessively, manually transferring fuel from the auxiliary tanks as the primary tanks ran low. Every man aboard understood, in mathematical terms they had calculated themselves during training, that the fuel they carried was not enough to reach China. Ditching at sea, bailing out over hostile territory, or crash landing along the coast were not contingencies. They were the expected outcome. What no one could have predicted was the tailwind. For nearly 7 hours during the return flight, an unexpected tailwind pushed the bombers along faster than their fuel consumption calculations accounted for, extending their effective range by roughly 250 extra miles, almost exactly the margin that the early launch had cost them. Without it, every surviving account of the mission agrees, all 16 aircraft would have gone down in the open ocean, hundreds of miles short of the Chinese coast. If this is giving you a different way to think about what it actually means to volunteer for a mission with no realistic chance of return, subscribe and hit the bell. New video every week at this level of detail. Back to the story. Even with the tailwind, 15 of the 16 aircraft never made it to a runway. They either ditched in the China Sea near the coast, or were deliberately crash-landed, with crews bailing out over eastern China as their fuel ran out completely in the dark. Only one aircraft, flown by Captain Edward York, diverted from the plan entirely. A carburetor malfunction was burning fuel at a catastrophic rate, and York made the decision to fly to the Soviet Union instead, landing near Vladivostok. He and his crew were interned by Soviet authorities for 14 months, before eventually making their way out through Iran. Of the 80 men who flew the mission, 69 made it back to American or Allied control, most after harrowing journeys on foot through Japanese-occupied Chinese territory, aided by villagers, missionaries, and Chinese guerrilla fighters who risked their own lives to hide and move the airmen toward safety. 3 men died during bailout or crash landing. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. Of those 8, 3 were executed by firing squad, and a 4th died in captivity from disease and starvation. The remaining 4 prisoners survived more than 3 years of captivity before being liberated at the end of the war. In purely material terms, the Doolittle Raid accomplished almost nothing. The bombs dropped on Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe struck oil tanks, a steel mill, several power plants, and an aircraft carrier under construction, damage that Japanese industry repaired within weeks. By any conventional military measure of a bombing raid, it was a minor footnote. What it was not minor in was the psychological effect on both sides of the Pacific. And that psychological effect, according to the Battle of Midway's own historical record, directly shaped one of the most consequential naval engagements of the entire war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet and the architect of Pearl Harbor, had been pushing for weeks before the raid for a Japanese operation to seize Midway Island and draw the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. He had faced significant internal resistance from other factions within the Japanese Navy, who favored expanding operations toward the Indian Ocean and India instead. According to the historical analysis published by Air University, the shock of the Doolittle Raid, the demonstrated vulnerability of the Japanese home islands to American air attack, became one of the decisive factors that tipped that internal debate in Yamamoto's favor. Yamamoto ultimately won that argument inside the Japanese Navy, with what multiple historical accounts describe as a thinly veiled threat to resign his command if his Midway plan wasn't adopted. 6 weeks after the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of Midway became the turning point of the entire Pacific War. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 275 aircraft, and approximately 5,000 men, including a disproportionate share of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men who had no realistic replacement in the years remaining in the war. From that point forward, Japan would never again hold the strategic initiative in the Pacific. In public, Yamamoto himself dismissed the Doolittle Raid as militarily insignificant, reportedly calling it a do-nothing raid. Privately, according to multiple historical accounts, he regarded it as a personal failure that he was determined not to allow to happen again. The raid also forced a strategic reallocation that historians rarely emphasize when discussing the Pacific War's broader arc. In the months that followed, Japan kept 4 entire Army fighter groups stationed in the home islands for homeland air defense, aircraft and pilots that were, by every operational account, badly needed in the South Pacific, where American and Australian forces were beginning to push back against Japanese expansion. A raid that caused what Japanese officials themselves described as negligible material damage had, in effect, pinned down resources that Japan could not afford to spare. For the American public, the psychological lift was immediate and, by multiple contemporary accounts, far larger than military planners had dared hope for. President Roosevelt, when asked by reporters where the bombers had launched from, gave a deliberately evasive answer, that they had come from Shangri-La, the fictional Himalayan paradise from the novel Lost Horizon. The joke became national news. For a country that had spent 4 months absorbing one defeat after another since Pearl Harbor, the idea that American bombers had reached Tokyo at all mattered more than what those bombers had actually destroyed. What happened to the Chinese civilians who helped the Doolittle Raiders survive after they bailed out and crash-landed across eastern China is a part of this story that rarely appears in American accounts of the mission, and it represents one of the most devastating consequences of any single American military operation of the war. According to research compiled by Reverend Charles Mias, an eyewitness missionary present in the region, Japanese forces launched a retaliatory campaign across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, specifically targeting Chinese communities suspected of aiding the American airmen. Villagers who had sheltered the raiders were tortured. In one documented case, soldiers forced a group of men who had fed the airmen to participate in what was described as a bullet contest, lining them up to determine how many bodies a single rifle round could pass through. Historians estimate the Japanese retaliatory campaign claimed approximately 250,000 Chinese lives, civilians whose only connection to the mission was the simple act of giving food, shelter, or directions to exhausted American airmen who had crash-landed in their fields. Reverend Mius, reflecting on what the airmen could not have known at the time, wrote that the small gifts the raiders gave their rescuers in gratitude, parachutes, gloves, cigarette packages, became weeks later the evidence that led Japanese soldiers directly to the people who had helped them. The 4 surviving crew members, held as prisoners of war for more than 3 years, endured conditions that the official record describes only in fragments: starvation rations, isolation, and beatings, in a war where America's adversary did not always observe the conventions other nations claimed to follow toward captured airmen. Among the 80 men who climbed into those 16 bombers were aviators, navigators, and gunners who came from every part of the country: farm towns in the Midwest, mill towns in New England, and communities across the Southwest and West Coast where Mexican-American families had deep roots in military aviation, going back to the years before the war. The raid asked the same thing of every one of them, regardless of where they came from. Volunteer for a mission with no guaranteed way home, and go anyway. Jimmy Doolittle crash-landed his own bomber in a rice paddy in China, certain that the mission had been a failure and that he would face a court-martial for losing every aircraft under his command. Instead, he was awarded the Medal of Honor and promoted 2 ranks to Brigadier General, a recognition even at the time that the raid's value had nothing to do with the material damage it caused. What the Doolittle Raid demonstrates more clearly than almost any other single operation of the Pacific War is that the calculation of military value cannot always be measured in tonnage of bombs or industrial targets destroyed. 80 men volunteered for a mission where the fuel math, calculated by the crews themselves before they ever took off, told them they would not make it home. They launched anyway, 250 miles farther from land than the plan had ever accounted for, because the alternative, turning the carrier around with 16 bombers still on deck, was judged to be a worse outcome for the country than the near certainty of losing those aircraft and possibly those men. The bombs that fell on Tokyo caused damage that Japanese industry repaired within weeks. The decision those bombs forced inside the Japanese Navy's high command, the validation they gave Yamamoto's argument for Midway, led 6 weeks later to the battle that broke Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. 16 bombers took off from a pitching carrier deck on the morning of April 18, 1942, carrying 80 men who had done the fuel math and understood exactly what it meant. They went anyway. And the raid that Yamamoto publicly dismissed as accomplishing nothing turned out to be one of the most consequential single decisions of the entire Pacific War.